Okay, good evening and welcome again. Welcome to the next installment of our lecture series for the semester titled Engaging Pluralism. It is my great pleasure today to welcome our very own Adam Frampton, who is a visiting critic here in the School of Architecture, teaching one of the sections of the Totalization Studio. In addition to being a faculty member here at Rice, Adam is teaching at Columbia and a few other universities as well. He has an MArch from Princeton University, and together with Karolina Czeczek, he runs a Brooklyn-based studio called Only If, and I'm sure he will maybe even reflect on the name of the studio in the talk and give us a little more insight on the name of the studio. Unfortunately, Karolina couldn't be with us here for the lecture tonight, but we look forward to having her here visit the school and the studio for the final review in November. She has an MArch from Yale University, where she is also teaching as a critic as well. After Adam's presentation, we will be joined by Associate Professor Troy Schaum, who will respond with a few thoughts to Adam's talk today and also kick off the conversation with the first few questions. The topic for our lecture series this year is Engaging Pluralism, trying to address how we as architects operate in a complex and pluralistic world. And it is particularly interesting to hear Adam today and learn more about the work of Only If Architecture, because through their work they respond to complexity and pluralism in a very particular way. And that is with a very deep sense of simplicity, grace, and return to some of the fundamentals of the discipline of architecture, including the appreciation for very simple geometrical forms and building forms, such as those that are circle and square and so on. So in that sense, it is an interesting combination of complexity, pluralism on the one hand, and simplicity on the other hand. So Adam, thank you for being with us both tonight and this semester here at Rice Architecture, and please join me in welcoming Adam to the podium. Thank you.
And thank you, Troy, also for having me here to the Rice School of Architecture. It's such a privilege and a pleasure to work with the students this semester. And Karolina sends her regrets. She's actually here, but just came down with a migraine after meeting with the students, and unfortunately, had nothing to do with the work. She did tell me that lunch was stuck between my teeth before she took off, so I'm thankful for that from her. But actually, I have to say that I'm sorry she can't be here, because it is our practice is very much a kind of partnership, and of course, one of the beauties of a kind of partnership is that we fill in for each other, and so it's vice versa always, and there's no single point of failure in a partnership either. So. Anyhow, our talk is entitled Far and Near, in a way based on the observation from our own practice and research about the kind of differences between seeing things up close and at a distance, and perhaps the benefits of a kind of simultaneous approach. This has to do with our work at different scales spatially. We work on very small projects with detail and materials in a very hands-on way. But also at an architectural scale, designing buildings, and finally at a kind of urban and regional scale of design, where we can sort of hopefully critically address larger questions about how cities and landscapes are formed, how they'll adapt and change in the future, and how we live collectively. So we started Only If about 9 years ago, myself and Karolina, among many other talented architects and designers that we work with. I'll present the work in kind of 5 chapters. First, speaking more abstractly about scale, simplicity, and geometry. Secondly, showing a kind of cross-section sort of survey of the different types and scales of work that we do. And then finally, looking at 3 more specific and interconnected research and design projects. This is a drawing that we always like to show. Whether far or near, I think each scale of work has its own techniques and resolution. It's a drawing, of course, from Le Corbusier. At the left, you can see a kind of Cartesian scale, and a grid applies, but at a larger scale and on the right, there's kind of natural systems, mountains, clouds, and kind of organic forms. On the left, we find materiality, precision, tactility. On the right, abstraction, looseness, greater degrees of tolerance and flexibility. And so in our own work, we like to think about all these things, the kind of artificial and the environmental, and to kind of be precise and loose, et cetera. This is also another drawing that we really like from the book Made in Tokyo by Atelier Bauau. And I think it's always been a kind of point of reference in terms of the interrelationship between architecture and urbanism, perhaps because there's kind of a distortion of scale that captures both the entire city and its individual buildings. And at a city scale, there's kind of questions of the infrastructural, the social, the political. And obviously, at an architectural scale, questions of kind of spatial, programmatic, and material. And as much as we do like to understand the kind of larger social and political context of our work, there's always certain pleasures in kind of what's immediate, either through materials or models shown here in our office, which usually we try to remain in hand. So we're particularly interested in the exchange between between architecture and urbanism, and to kind of to quote one of Karolina's teachers, Piero Vittorio Aureli, wrote that those who focus on the political economy tend to view the role of architectural form as irrelevant in the development of the city. Those who focus on architecture and urban design seem completely uninterested in engaging the political and economic forces that produce the city. And I think that this kind of siloing of knowledge or practice is perhaps more apparent in the US as compared to other places where architects do practice. And so I think to avoid that kind of disconnect, we like to look at how these two separate disciplines can communicate more with each other and how techniques from one scale might inform the other, and vice versa. The studio that I'm teaching here under the totalization framework is dealing with indeterminacy. And it's actually not something that's like kind of embodied within any of our projects right now at the moment, but it is more of a kind of ambition. And I think in a way, it also comes from this thinking about, how a question like how can buildings work more like cities, which leads us to think about indeterminacy in architecture. Also, just to add or explain maybe more about the approach of our practice, a couple of years ago we were asked to pick a book for an exhibition that represents our work, and this is actually one of Karolina's children's books by El Lissitzky, which is a kind of story about two protagonists who are squares, who kind of arrive from outer space and attempt to impose kind of revolutionary order on the chaos of society. And so I think it says something too about maybe this, what Igor may have mentioned about kind of relationships between simplicity and complexity as we understand it. And we noticed in our own work that we often like to kind of impose legibility through Platonic shapes like squares. And the design process also becomes about establishing these sort of geometrical constraints as very simple forms, as in this design for a single-family house. Or at the city scale, in the kind of design of a master plan where we used a grid and a kind of 5x5 square to arrange potential development. Of course, not always about squares. A building with different distinct faces, two different distinct faces and a kind of third service face. We use a triangle to kind of arrange the parts. And in other cases, in some cases, geometry is kind of imposed. In other cases, I think we look for where it can be found from certain sites. In this case, a temporary pavilion based on found geometry in New York City where Broadway intersects diagonally with the grid. So now I'm speaking as Karolina, shifting voices here. So one characteristic of our practice is that we're working across these different scales and typologies. And I'll just kind of briefly I'm going to show a range of different projects in a very succinct way. Despite, I think, the general tendency to think about architecture as permanent, a lot of our projects are kind of temporary installations for public spaces and cultural venues designed with the consideration of time and change, as in the case of the Times Square Heart invited competition. Another kind of temporary space, an invited competition for the Performa Biennial. The brief of this particular competition asked for a wide range of functions to be accommodated in a small space: a performance area, screening, meeting and work zones, cafeteria, library, bookstore, etc. In this project, our interest in organizational potential of simple Platonic shapes is deployed again, rather than adding kind of another layer of complexity. And we decided to create, in this case, an open grid, non-prescriptive field layout using cross-shaped volumes, again, not unlike maybe a city, that would kind of accommodate all these different demands of the brief in this case, and kind of changing uses and functions. And so the space that we made with kind of CMU blocks that instead of mortar were kind of strapped together so they could be easily disassembled, worked as a kind of enfilade gallery and space for performance art or other more utilitarian functions at other times as well. The projects that we've realized, as I would kind of say maybe a still young office in New York, are mainly interiors. This is one of the first ones, a very small coffee bar located in the financial district that's about 550 square feet, located on what kind of looks like a street but is in fact an underground subway concourse. The project is organized into two circles, a positive one and a kind of negative circle, the negative one being used as a kind of seating area. And the organization of the space allows for different seating arrangements and kind of social interactions between its users. We don't see our work at this scale really as interior decoration, but rather kind of strategic application of materials, colors, and textures to emphasize architectural elements, clarify space, and designed forms, as shown in the collage study. And in this case, using kind of a combination of high and low materials, black marble, silver painted OSB, rubber, perforated aluminum. It's on the one hand kind of a conscious selection, and on the other hand a kind of collage of overlapping formal and material logics. And I should say also, before we started, only if we actually had no experience or little experience at this scale or with interior design. And so I think we approach it maybe with some degree of naivete as to what interior design customarily is, which in turn kind of characterizes our approach. And all these projects are located in New York City, where there's a degree of involvement and a very kind of hands-on way of working that I think would otherwise be absent in larger or remote projects, which was our past experience, I think, prior to starting the practice, which in a way also enables us to be more experimental. And so then we became kind of accidental experts in coffee bar design. I think this is not, retrospectively, I realize that the trajectory of many offices is perhaps more accidental in some ways than not, in terms of what you do and what one thing leads to another. In this project, the coffee is prepared and served from a central rectangular island, where all the kind of infrastructure of coffee making, espresso machines, grinders, taps, pastry display, and a platform elevator are sort of seamlessly integrated into this island. And what that also does is kind of choreographs the movement of customers into a loop from the point of sale to drink pickup to condiments, in effect facilitating optimization and speed, both of the customers and the baristas behind the island. And that in turn kind of slows down other spaces. Here, a back room designed as a seating area with a continuous banquette on its perimeter. And it's the materials and lighting kind of intended to produce a calmer, slower space within the project. Another interior project is an 18,000 square foot office space in New York for 3 very different companies under the same ownership, one of them being a fashion company. And we designed the space according to a very neutral, simple framework that kind of unified the disparate parts the office, the floor and everything connected to the floor being black, while the walls and everything that related to them were white. Not to be too dogmatic, we started to introduce other materials, textures, and colors, which formed kind of islands throughout the plan. For the clear span space in the floor plate and being a showroom for a fashion company, we designed these kind of 4 mirror-clad volumes that sort of preserve the expansiveness of the space. And the volumes are used as storage and display for a fashion company, but more importantly, through their individual and collective form, allow for kind of manipulation of space. So they're on sort of rollers that enable different configurations, from a kind of cross figure, subdividing 4 separate focus zones into one big meeting or runway space, to kind of looser arrangements, to the kind of possibility of storing them all together at the end of the day. And so I think that these interior projects, in a way, kind of, we're trying to consider design elements that act more like flexible infrastructure to enable change, and which is, again, I would say, like maybe a strategy one encounters more in sort of urbanism or urban design rather than kind of interior design. Houses and housing are another typology that appears in our work. This is a single-family house located in Atlanta, Georgia, organized on a kind of square plan with circulation and wet areas plugged into the side to kind of maximize living space within that square volume. The house was actually designed as a prototype of an adaptable system that can be modified from kind of upright tower form for a corner lot into kind of a horizontal and more linear volume on a deeper through lot, but can also, in effect, take other forms throughout different urban conditions. This is another single-family house, a beach house that's currently under construction, located on Fire Island, raised to anticipate flooding and rising sea levels. It's organized into a series of volumes that consolidate bathrooms, kitchen, and storage. And you can see here, for instance, some of the volumes kind of slide from inside to out. And the one in the center is actually a kind of outdoor void, shown here, recently becoming a kind of slender outdoor courtyard space in the middle of the house. And another raised beach house, this one in Delaware on the coast, also elevated, organized into 3 squares, and then a kind of tower volume which pinwheel around a central courtyard volume in the project too. We're working on both houses and housing, and I think concurrently, both in our practice and teaching, we're kind of deeply engaged with questions and issues around multifamily housing. That's also the kind of brief that my students are working on here at the moment. And I think because housing kind of constitutes the quote unquote everyday and the majority of the substance of the city, housing is also a kind of, in a way for us, a kind of bridge between architecture and urbanism. And I think for our generation, I would say that housing is an increasingly important territory for architectural invention. This is a project for a community nonprofit developer where we really tried to kind of avoid sort of institutional design that often characterizes senior housing. We tried to maximize the efficiencies of the units to produce excesses elsewhere in the project. So compressing the unit made this kind of large double-height collective space in the center called the loggia, which is a sort of shared gathering space for seniors. And that, in a way, by locating it on the second floor or third floor, the space becomes kind of central both in a formal and communal sense. This drawing cuts through the center of that loggia, and it shows on the ground floor also how we organize the kind of program into 2 bars and a circle, allowing basically passage from the front to the kind of back of the project, shown here. And I don't think I have drawings of it, but this also creates a kind of connection from grounds leading up. There's a sort of secondary pathway of circulation that leads up into the loggia and up to the 4th floor through the kind of project. This is a project, one of the kind of urban scale projects. So we've gone from kind of 550 square feet to much larger scale, located in Xi'an in China. But I think this one maybe shows or demonstrates how we like to think about geometry. In this case, a field-like checkerboard pattern to kind of accommodate a requirement in this competition for 50% open space. And the pattern, through its gradation, basically also accommodates a range of different building types that were needed in the campus. And the deployment of these types creates kind of alternating built and unbuilt spaces. Another urban, or rather regional scale project that's closer to home is in New York. Together with One Architecture, we were invited, or we won a competition and worked with the Regional Planning Association to contribute to their 4th regional plan, which is an interesting kind of long-term vision for the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut metropolitan area that transcends sort of short-term interests within these kind of fragmented geographic and political jurisdictions. And in fact, New York hasn't had a master plan since 1969, I think. So in many ways, the regional plan, which happens every 25 years or so, functions as such. Our assignment for this design initiative was to kind of look at this corridor, which extends from Brooklyn to Queens to the Bronx, 24 miles in length, covering 80 square miles in area with a population of 2.6 million people. And RPA basically projected kind of huge population increases. But there's now a kind of, in New York City, a big focus on this area because of the kind of increasing unaffordability of the center. And so actually rotating the map brought the kind of familiar map of New York City, I think, brings this area into focus and creates a kind of non-Manhattan-centric view of the city. The corridor is actually based on a set of underutilized existing freight tracks, which was kind of a given in the project. And we were looking at essentially the repurposing of these tracks to connect Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx via the Triborough line, which is now in its latest iteration called the Interborough Express, and really linking the outer boroughs with new passenger train service. So basically right now the subways in New York radiate from the center. And so when one of them fails, like the L train, everyone's out of luck. The Triborough essentially creates this kind of circumferential connection and new spatial relationships between diverse communities, people, and jobs. And this transformation was first envisioned in the 1929 regional plan. And so basically we created a very large drawing. This is kind of, it's too big to show on a screen, so these are kind of fragments of it. It's a drawing about also, I think, the kind of relationship between architectural form and the city, looking at a series of locations along the corridor and new train stations, some envisioned to be very simple platforms, others where more complex infrastructural nodes require kind of significant investment to be resolved, and our site for the studio is right here. So the studio is also in a way kind of connected to that. And more than just transit, the Triborough line, our study was kind of about creating these relationships between proximities between the workforce and workplaces, particularly for economic sectors that are not centered in Manhattan, like education, healthcare, logistics, manufacturing, and food. We also looked at, because we were using a lot of existing elevated infrastructure, how we could create kind of public spaces throughout the 24-mile length of the corridor. And I think the potential of this project is, not only a lot of development and transportation connectivity, but also the activation of residual public spaces adjacent to the train line itself, and a kind of 23-mile, 24-mile linear park, sometimes, in this case, adjacent to the new Triborough track, in other cases, underneath spaces that are currently sort of derelict. So those are kind of, I would say, design projects maybe within our office, design/research. Some of our projects are kind of purely research-based. And this is a project actually that I did together with Jonathan Solomon and Clara Wong about 10 years ago about Hong Kong. So this was actually prior to Only If, but somehow important in terms of ways of thinking about engaging the places we lived, because Karolina and I both lived in Hong Kong before coming to New York. And this project actually is really just, I think, about kind of observation of the city at that time, and looking at a kind of city through very architectural techniques and methods, which I would say is kind of connected to other ways that we are sort of working. So it resulted in a book called Cities Without Ground from 2012. And it's a kind of strange book because it's not really a monograph. It's not a kind of architectural or urban history. It's not, despite its title, it's not even really a guidebook in the sense that you would have a difficult time kind of wayfinding with it, as some of our Amazon reviewers have noted, disappointingly. And the book was actually really kind of also a response to the refrain that we always heard there, that Hong Kong has no public space, which we didn't really find to be true. This was actually at a moment where I would say that the kind of political activity of the city was very different than this was preceding the kind of the umbrella revolution and all the activities that have happened lately. And I guess our hypothesis in the project was that that Hong Kong did have public space, but it just didn't resemble traditional public space as we think of it in a kind of from a Western perspective. And so the book really set out to kind of record a certain spatial condition at a certain time. And so as a kind of visitor to the city, I think one would, at least I was always struck by how, at street level, there's really a lack of so-called traditional urban legibility. Aside from lacking notions of center, axis, edge, there's a very unique form of kind of three-dimensionality of public space. And many of the kind of binary oppositions that we use to talk about public space and define the city, like public, private, outside, inside, figure ground, above, below, or quotidian and futuristic, are either kind of, in a way, blurred or collapsed, I would argue, through an image like this. And so our book documents a condition which is not really a condition of three-dimensionality, which is not just kind of a single layer that's added on top of the city, but more than that. And this is the central and mid-levels escalator, where the situation is, I would say, also kind of resembles many sort of architectural utopias, early 20th century visions of future cities by those like, Hilbersheimer, Santelia, et cetera. But we obviously it wasn't kind of conceived as such by those creating it, engineers and architects creating it. So basically, as we began to draw these networks and plan, we discovered the kind of extent and variety of their footprint over Hong Kong Island and Kowloon, beyond a kind of small area that we first looked at jointly in 2010 for the Venice Biennale. And so we decided that somehow kind of a mapping of everything that existed would be most interesting. Spaces including pedestrian overpasses, tunnels, bridges, shopping malls, hotel atria, subway platforms, and concourses. We looked at a lot of existing maps. There were a lot of problems with like flat maps because you have to move kind of up and down to get through. The subway MTR produced their own maps, which were slightly more useful for navigation because they stretched the z-axis, which we applied in our own map making. But they also only continued to the extent of the kind of MTR system, the station. They ended at the end of the station. Similarly, shopping malls made kind of quite interesting three-dimensional maps, but again ended where the kind of consumption stopped. So our technique was basically to kind of to stitch them all together. And so the book basically consists of 32 maps that show seamlessly all the areas publicly accessible on foot, irrespective of properties, irrespective of boundaries of ownership or management, indoor or outdoor, combining information from different sources into a single graphic. On top of this, we started to note both official and unofficial places and events that develop a kind of narrative about the network. And so you see a range of activities and kind of juxtapositions that start to occur. So we don't claim it's more useful as a wayfinding tool, but it does maybe in a way make legible the kind of spatial and programmatic logic of the city through some of these maps. One of my favorites is the Shuntak Center, which we argue functions like a kind of intermodal switch with double-decker buses, trams, subways, hydrofoils, helicopter to Macau, and in fact there's even a kind of border crossing where one departs Hong Kong within, sectionally within the building over here. Admiralty, West Kowloon, as it was under construction, now mostly completed 10 years later. Kowloon Tong, some of the kind of almost Pyrenean space of shopping malls, et cetera. And so actually just this past year, we were very excited to be invited to display the project in the M+, the new contemporary art museum that just opened in Hong Kong. We created a kind of a 2 by 3 meter model where we show those spaces, basically the public space, the voids as kind of solids in a sort of floating model on aluminum rods above the kind of etched plan of the city below on plates. Shown here being assembled in our office after 3D printing it for about 2 months straight on a kind of army of 3D printers. And this is, finally, I'll just show one quick project that we're kind of working on right now, which was initiated actually through Karolina's teaching. And in a way looking at, this is a kind of water map of New York City, looking at the systems of water supply from the different upstate reservoirs and watersheds that are managed and run by New York City into kind of water infrastructure in the sort of city itself. And this led her to actually create a kind of index of all of the public pools in New York City, which basically we haven't built any pools for the last 50 years or so. There's an incredible set of pools, but there's, I think, about one pool for every 200,000 people. And so, or 250,000 New York City residents. So the pool that we became most interested in is actually Kosciuszko Pool, which is our local pool where we live and work in Brooklyn, which was interestingly actually designed by Morris Lapidus, who grew up in Bed-Stuy, who was mostly known as a kind of designer of very opulent Miami hotel interiors, but was commissioned by Mayor Lindsay to create a quite interesting kind of public pool. And it's a very kind of, it's entirely concrete kind of landscape of water. It has a lot of issues. There's a lot of operational issues at the moment. And so right now this is all we can show. We're working on a very large model and to contribute to a exhibition coming up in New York City in the spring at a museum to kind of imagine the next 50 years of this pool, basically. And so, in a way, I think the project's kind of, it's a huge range of different projects. We never know how to like explain our office or what we do, but I do feel like there's something that, a way of thinking that we kind of benefit from, maybe from working from, the kind of 550 square foot to the kind of regional, and eventually, hopefully, to the kind of civic. I'd like to show 3 more projects in a little more detail. The first being another research project and hopefully forthcoming publication titled Irregular Development. And this is also a project looking at the city where we live and work and considering the potential of its kind of leftover and marginal spaces. New York City is known for its grid, and in the past, well-known architects have theorized New York City based on the grid, the so-called 1811 Commissioner's Plan, which is shown here. But of course, what's interesting for us about this map is that the 1811, the grid plan was not, in fact, a tabula rasa. The grid overlapped many different pre-existing conditions, land ownership lines, indigenous occupation, natural systems and ecology, and other kinds of infrastructures. And artists and architects have pointed out the kind of aberrations or glitches in the grid. For instance, Gordon Matta Clark's well-known project about vacant lots that occurred through surveying accidents. We kind of, in the 2017, we wanted to kind of recreate this project or tap into this project, but of course it's not possible. It's a very different context in the 1970s. But irrespective, we kind of mapped all of the narrow, irregular, or small lots in New York City using GIS software. This is actually an area near our neighborhood where there's a lot of vacant lots created due to so-called urban renewal, but also historic conditions, accidents, train easements, et cetera. And so using GIS, we cataloged all of these. We found, we cataloged all the vacant irregular lots into different typologies. We found 3,600 in total, 600 in blue here, owned by New York City itself. And these are the kind of triangular ones, which obviously have more or less three sides. These are the narrow lots, which is a term, in fact, defined by the zoning resolution, because you're really not allowed to build on lots less than 18 feet wide since 1961. These are the small lots, again, terminology coming from the zoning resolution. And this was our own invention, which is self-explanatory maybe. And by cataloging and mapping, we started to think about housing types that might exist on these vacant lots and irregular spaces in the city. And as I said, currently code and zoning prevents development on many of these lots, but didn't stop us from kind of speculating on that. We exhibited this in the 2017 Shenzhen Biennale. The wall actually shows 600 of the city-owned lots kind of extruded to their as-of-right potential if zoning were to allow development. And on the 9 pedestals shows some speculative housing prototypes that might occupy these lots. And for us, really the question of the vacant irregular lots are connected to questions of housing, the housing crisis that we find ourselves within. But I think also at a moment where, as a young architect, looking at so many big developer projects happening by established architects on big lots, and trying to find a model for smaller scale intervention and perhaps participation by people like us. So this next project is really connected to that, I would say. And so in 2019, we'd like to take credit for it, but maybe we can't. New York City basically initiated a competition to deal with some of the 600 lots that it owns, 23 in fact. And the competition was called, organized by New York City Housing Preservation and Development and the AIA. And they identified essentially 23 lots that we had been studying before, and they asked to design affordable housing on one subject infill lot on West 136th Street. And based on our design, we were one of the finalists, and we're waiting for a long time for the city to initiate the next step of the competition, which will eventually result in hopefully some of the 23 lots being transferred to us as developers to develop affordable housing on them. And hopefully this is also hopefully seen as a kind of pilot project, which will allow the city to change the zoning to kind of unlock the untapped potential of many of these kind of lots. So this is the competition design, very much like a kind of 21st century housing in a late 19th or early 20th century context. On the one hand, the design is totally different and new, kind of acknowledging contemporary housing types, construction needs, and densities. On the other hand, the design does try to address its neighbors through the reintroduction of the stoop, with its kind of social function of mediating the public to the domestic, and to some degree kind of alignment and patterning of the brick to adjacent decoration. Within our project, we introduced 7 units to kind of maximize the as-of-right density if competition assumed that certain things would be relaxed. And I think we had more units than most of our competitors. It was really, we felt it was the only way to really make the project financially feasible and maximize the potential of the site. but also to kind of hopefully include a diversity of different unit types to achieve a mix of different people, even examining models of kind of ownership versus tenancy, rental units, which are typically seen as two completely separate things that never commingle in the same building in many, except for some instances. So in a way, this is also kind of inflected by the section here. And the feasibility of the project was a really weird competition because I think our degree of invention was very technical in some ways. And we thought that in a way, being very strategic to avoid the infrastructure of larger buildings would be instrumental. So we wanted to actually avoid an elevator. Although the elevator would allow us to exceed 4 stories, including mezzanines, we calculated the additional cost of an elevator and space utilized would actually compress livable space and counterintuitively wouldn't generate more net usable space in the project. And so therefore the ground floor has a fully accessible 2-bedroom unit. Moving up, there's the street-facing unit with its kind of stoop. We propose kind of micro studios, which have a kind of additional amount of height and mezzanine space to compensate for the kind of small footprint. And really, I think the kind of non-standard ceiling height makes the small space much more livable, brings in more daylight. And on the left is kind of a diagram of a thickened wall. Within quite compact units, storage becomes very essential. These prefabricated components perform many of the functions and thicken one of the outside walls to allow remaining livable space to remain clear, hopefully avoiding kind of cluttered feel inside of the unit itself. And on the roof, there's a north-facing balcony for one as a private outdoor space and a common balcony south-facing for all the tenants of the building. The project was actually designed like right before 2020, but I think outdoor spaces like these have been increasingly kind of critical during COVID. And the last project, third and last project that I'd like to share in more detail is the Narrow House, which is, in fact, is a kind of self-initiated project and also our own home. And really, this kind of parallels these two projects. We've actually been working on this problem since 2015. So the beginning of this precedes the research, even though we present it in kind of reverse. And so this is basically one of the vacant lots that we mapped. It's 13'4" wide, or about 4 meters, from the yellow left side of the yellow truck to the kind of beige wall at the right. So basically half of the gap between the two buildings. And it's maybe hard to see here, but the typical lots in New York City are 20 or 25 feet wide. This one is just 13'4". Under the zoning resolution, as I mentioned, it's too narrow to build on. We had to, in fact, prove that the lot predated the zoning resolution in 1961 and could be developed through an exception that allows 1 or 2 family houses in some limited circumstances and by meeting other criteria, essentially. And so this is the design for the single-family house, seen here from the kind of aerial view on the left. This one looks skinny, but it's just one building. An unfortunate situation for our photograph, but you can actually see over here there's 3 lots that are, for some reason, 13'4" wide. So I think it was basically 40 feet that was divided 3 times rather than 2 times. We don't really understand why. Next door is actually a city-owned lot, which is coincidentally one of the 23 lots from the Big Ideas for Small Lots competition. And from the outside, this building is really prescribed by, the envelope is really prescribed by the zoning regulations. So you can see that it's finished in a kind of black stucco with glass that's detailed flush. The front and the back of the building are largely glazed because we can't rely on the lateral walls for legal light and air. Structural bracing is also revealed behind the front facade, which flips to avoid door and window openings, and also provides the lateral stability of the house, which is a consequence of the absence of structural walls inside of the house itself. And so here you can see the front and back elevations. There's, in fact, structural bracing concealed in the back, which is hidden above this pivot door here. And that's the kind of 11 foot by 11 foot opening to the rear yard. And I think, interestingly, in a way, the kind of landscape has this unexpected presence inside the house that we didn't maybe fully anticipate, because we are in the very unusual position of living in the thing that we kind of designed and developed, which is probably a whole nother lecture that we won't, the experience of which I think is definitely enabled, we're very fortunate to be able to do, definitely enabled kind of degrees of experimentation. But yeah, so this is us. This is Karolina here. Now you can see her. So the outside of the house is mostly dictated by zoning. We focused our efforts more on the interior organization, and I think to avoid kind of typical brownstone dumbbell organization of a floor plan, we introduced a split-level system with a kind of spiraling staircase. And in a way, the staircase is the house. Each landing of the staircase becomes a living area. A void in the middle allows daylight from the top to penetrate down through the building. Daylight is really a kind of key element in the design related to those glass front and back elevations, and also really avoiding a plan that would be otherwise very dark because of its proportions in the center. And the house is shown here in section. The first floor is, as you can see, slightly raised above the street level to kind of create some privacy and separation as you enter. We have an open living area on the ground floor. We have 2 bedrooms up here and a kind of study, which in the future can be adapted into a 3rd bedroom if needed. The stairs are kind of a key element that I'll come back to. They are steeper as you enter, and then they become more relaxed as you move up. But in this case, really the split level is used as a device to differentiate between spaces where walls, rooms, or corridors, none of which we really have above grade in the house, would be conventionally used to define spaces and differentiate program. This is the first floor under construction. The building structure is 2 CMU walls and a composite corrugated metal deck spanning between it. It's about the maximum possible span of the material without additional steel beams underneath. When we needed to frame an opening for the stairs going into the cellar, we used upstanding beams into the concrete slab, which preserves kind of thinness of the floors, a detail that we took from Sejima, who I think took it from Toyo Ito. And so this is the ground floor of the house with the dining room, dining space, kitchen, bar, and living space. Here you can see, actually this is the model from schematic design. You can see here in the one-to-one model, the kitchen bar, the stairs, and the kind of plywood volume. Inside the house is exactly 11 foot clear. But obviously with these proportions and of spaces and kind of very generous ceiling heights, doesn't really feel narrow or claustrophobic. And so what you see at right is, I think, trying to use materials to kind of code or render legible certain parts of the house. So I'll just briefly speak about this kitchen bar, which is a 28 foot wide long volume, unusually deep, 36 inches, which we use to kind of avoid cabinets above. Made out of terrazzo countertop, black stained oak, perforated metal. And this is actually the end of the kitchen bar where you can see the black perforation kind of echoing the stairs. And so we're trying to kind of also, I think, create certain relationships between materials and, in this case, kind of echoing each other. The other key element is the kind of stairs here. And here you can see actually how, the stairs are, well, we chose to make them, we kind of we basically acted as general contractor on the project. We subcontracted a lot of different key elements in it. And we got to work directly with, while a lot of things are very cheap and kind of industrial and off the shelf, in other cases we worked with incredibly talented fabricator, steel fabricator in this case, And the stairs are, they're built out of perforated metal, which allows light to come through, not only in that void in the middle, but also through the treads and the risers themselves. I think generating a lot of really interesting spatial effects, shadow, texture, especially against the uniformity of the kind of painted sheetrock and seamless polyurethane, poured polyurethane floors. And so from above, you can see actually how they ascend from ground level to the study at left and the bedroom, 2 bedrooms on the right. And so this is moving up from the ground floor plan to the upper level with the study, a split level with a study and a first bedroom and a south-facing roof terrace and a second bedroom. The plywood volume that you've seen over here is very instrumental in, it's really the only division of space inside the majority of the house. We tried to avoid kind of typical subdivision by walls, and so we have this sort of Miesian volume that contains and encloses all the storage and bathroom functions. This is looking towards the study and then looking towards the plywood volume from the study. And so this plywood volume basically contains all storage and bathroom functions and has a series of different pocket doors that create separation from living to sleeping areas, et cetera. And then it also, the project wouldn't have been possible if the lot had been like 3 inches less. It would have been a completely different layout because this volume essentially with the clearances on either side and kind of minimum shower depth and minimum closet depth would have, basically a different lot size would have resulted in almost a completely different design. And so here you can see what it does on the inside, which is a kind of bathroom closed off on the 3rd floor with daylight coming in from above. So the project is in a way very important to us, and we live in it now, and it I think represents a kind of specific architectural proposition, but also perhaps a kind of larger manifesto that looks at speculates on the potential of overlooked and vacant and irregular narrow spaces in the city and urban contexts. And so hopefully embedded within this small project is kind of bigger thinking about the city itself. Thank you.
Check, check. Check. They can hear me? Can you hear me? Oh, this is for online?
Yeah.
Oh, so I yell.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh. Yeah, so this is a new thing I haven't experienced before exactly, so I could fail at this. Am I supposed to be up front?
I don't know if you're online.
Okay. Okay. So I guess, Adam, this is kind of an impossible task, knowing your work as well as I do over the years, but also seeing a lecture that is, can you hear me in the back? Also seen as a lecture that includes regional plan for the tri-state area, as well as competition I lost, actually, so congratulations. Several competitions I also lost that were in that.
We've lost a lot of competitions, too.
Yeah. From the regional plan of the tri-state area down to CDs with bathroom layouts in a house and trying to sum it up. So, but at the same time, there's a lot of beauty and a lot of consistency, I think, in the way the work is conceived, and so I'm going to attempt to do a kind of summation. I mean, I think that for me, the project of representation that carries through the work and the clarity of the representation and the modeling and in the drawing, for me, maybe offered a clue to reflecting on a couple tensions in the work that I thought was interesting, some of which you already reflected on. There's a kind of almost really heavy gestalt logic that exists in a lot of your work, where the figure all of a sudden sometimes becomes the most present object in the frame, and there's a kind of almost staring at that figure until you tease out. I think the office project for 3 companies showed that. You stared at those figures of the rolling objects long enough that they could do almost everything, into moments where the figure almost disappears and becomes a kind of displacement, for imagining the periphery. And I think that tendency in the work is how I could maybe begin to tie together the obsessive preciousness of the detail and the kind of richness of the detail with the work that would look at the the whole city. And I think where I'm going with this is that you also mentioned, which you and I have talked about, not in this lecture, that there's the kind of always the tension between as a young practice, the practice you imagine you're going to have, which I see represented in the Lissitzky image of the simple figures, and then there's the practice that you make, which is the practice that I see represented in the kind of periphery of the small leftover lots of the city. And I think through your lecture, that kind of gestalt of like at moments the project you imagine, like the project of Lissitzky would like come forward, and projects that you're making start to like the projects of the periphery or the small lot like start to come forward in different ways. But actually I see them connected because the way in which you use that figure, the figure of Lissitzky, is always a kind of a use of like displacement. So the figure enters the frame, and you could almost title your lecture like a project about the margin or about the periphery. And even in the coffee shops, there's like a figure that enters the frame, and it forces the public or forces the subject that's inhabiting the space that exists in the periphery and actually confront the detail in a really like up close way. Like all those figures in your spaces, and I mean this as kind of a deliberate compliment, are almost like too big. They always rupture. There's a moment where the circle in the senior living like actually ruptures out. There's a rupture of the figure outside of your beach house. All of the units of the housing and the senior living have to get smaller so that the people living at the periphery of that big figure actually become kind of compressed. And so I see the periphery, like when you're in Hong Kong, the periphery becomes like the kind of space of movement in the city. The periphery becomes an obsession with and a healthy obsession, hopefully, with the kind of like small-scale lots of New York that actually exist in a way on the periphery, and that you reorient the center of New York to actually start to study this area that the Brooklyn, Queens area on the edge of the city, and a kind of obsession with the periphery. So I think there's something about your technique that's actually representationally consistent, but pushing this kind of tension between a kind of formal object in the center of the frame and how it's displacing a kind of subject to the periphery. And is that like deliberate? I mean, this is my bigger question. Like, is that like a deliberate project that you're like engaging in from day one? I mean, you could easily say, no, definitely not. Is it like the project of necessity that emerges because you're a young practice that's in a way, and a fellow traveler, like been pushed to the periphery and trying to find a space at the edge while like, certain unnamed practices like take the center? Is it because there's an actual technique of a larger urban practice that I think is a little bit different than the Corbusian modular image that you used as a kind of description, that like maybe actually examines the potential of operating in a series of like contorted or reframed like peripheries. So anyway, I thought that was a kind of a nice tension, because the periphery is what gives us a space to kind of imagine the detail, and it gives us a space to kind of imagine maybe a different kind of subjectivity. So did I do that right? And so then, is that a question? Did I ask them to answer, or how do I do that? Yeah.
Yeah, it's not a question, but it's. I
guess the question is like, my question is, if there's you can entertain some kind of tension that I'm proposing between an imagination of your work as these figures, or imagination of your work as a project that exists on the periphery, is that something you see now as a deliberate part of your practice, or is that something that's emerging out of a necessity for a young practice to find a project?
Yeah, no, I think it's a very astute reading of what we're doing, and I think we haven't. It's not that we've conceptualized all of it as precisely as you have, but I do think that it's kind of we realized at some point that we started the office and had experience working on kind of prestigious projects in a big office with and you as a young architect, it's not that you start an office and then people start handing you these kind of projects, right? And so we were confronted, and I'm a little bit maybe hesitant to kind of also claim that we're like kind of peripheral or something, because we're not at the same time, but I think we're very conscious of the kind of maybe marginal status of kind of young architectural practice is a better way to put it. And I think we've thought a lot about that position and how to move around that position or how to kind of harness it. And doing kind of project like this, which again, as I said, we're fortunate enough to have the means to do and figured it out over a very long process how to do essentially development, also development and architecture and kind of general, contracting it. We came at that because we didn't see the opportunities elsewhere, right? And so I think reflecting on that kind of trajectory and the way in which this project has become very important somehow, we started kind of conceptualizing a lot of the other work in the same way. Like we're interested in New York City is a place that there's like so many architects and so many people have studied it, and there's like Delirious New York, and there's all kinds of theories and manifestos and in a way, like what new can we do here? Like, I think we had to kind of look outside at the spaces that have not been studied as much, and the kind of, this Kosciuszko pool in Bed-Stuy is like a amazing kind of gem in clear sight, right? And the vacant lots actually we didn't even know existed until we found one because we were looking for something weird to kind of live in and buy, and then we started looking at. So I think through that kind of lens of marginal or peripheral, I think we very deliberately tried to kind of find ways to make kind of inventive practice through that. Yeah.
I knew you were going to answer this way. I want to push on this a little bit more to say that it's coming out of some imagination of practice. The project that you did with Clara and Jonathan before you started the practice in Hong Kong when you were working for these big firms, you said, there was no public space in Hong Kong, but you found the public space in these peripheral moments already, right? And if we look at your work, even in your own house, the way you organize the space in your own house, you put these big objects in the middle of the space. And I know there's that's a technique, Miesian technique, you described it, whatever, but when you start to connect it to all of the other projects, you force everyone to circulate at the edge. You always have the bathroom at the edge. There's this kind of, anyway, I think, even the pool project, this is sorry, I'm riffing on my own reading too much, and I don't know if this is what you want, but even the pool project, a pool is a big figure in the middle of another boundary that then explored the public space on the periphery, right? And so I think that there's a gravitation that's linking together in your work for me, a kind of a graphic way of seeing, is I guess what I'm getting at, that's helping you see the city in a particular way that also is linking into other interests you have in kind of subjectivity and questions of how your own practice organizes itself in the space of the economic politics of having a practice. But nonetheless, I think that's what I kind of enjoyed about the work was the representation so beautiful and so clear. You could actually read a way of seeing across these projects at different scales. So yeah. I'll open up to the.
Just one thing to add, and then we'll let people ask questions. No, I think actually I appreciate that you're connecting the kind of methodology and the subject of the projects in a way to the kind of formal approach or to the kind of organizational approach. And we haven't actually conceived of it as such, but your description we'll take it. and I think that. I would say that I spent a long time, because it was kind of also a project with Jonathan and Clara before the office, I spent a long time trying to figure out what that project meant, right? Because it was sort of drawing highly complex, filigree, interesting, but also kind of almost formless, leftover spaces in a kind of city. And the translation was not direct in terms of how we took that and tried to think about a kind of continuity from that project to other projects. But the continuity was more, abstract in that I think it led to kind of, after that, we did kind of irregular development. We said we have to think about, okay, we lived in Hong Kong and I looked at this way with them of kind of understanding the city. Now we have to do the same for New York in a kind of different way. And, following, of course, well-known approaches of contemporary architectural manifestos somehow always, I think Enrique Walker has written about this, always follow cities, Las Vegas, Tokyo, Manhattan, et cetera, New York, et cetera. So, yeah, I think your reading of it as a kind of methodology that translates into kind of a formal approach is new for us and interesting.
I'll say this, somebody that's followed the work for a long time. I always thought Adam and Karolina always start a design project by putting something too big for a space in the space as a way to read it. And you see that in some of their early competitions where they're bounded. There's something that shows up in the space that's a little bit too big to be there, which creates its own kind of periphery for the subjects that, marginalization for the subjects that show up in the space. They have to confront the object because it's too big. They have to confront the space between the object and the wall. And so I thought that in this longer presentation of your work, you start to see that, that negotiation actually becoming important for you in a kind of cool way. But anyway, there should be other questions in the audience, I think.
Yeah.
Albert, yeah.
Oh, right. The microphone I'm not talking into. I was desperate to make connections between cities without ground and your work. And you were just saying that it wasn't so direct. I was waiting for you to talk about this house, because you were saying that what's different from that in the traditional house, the brownstone, was the fact that the landings became floors. When a landing becomes a floor, it changes, existentially, it changes everything about that space, right? When all of a sudden it's an extension of a circulation piece. That to me is directly related to cities without ground, right? That the two can, I mean, I think that there were lessons that I learned in that book, right? That would be similar to the one that I just tried to draw out of your project. And I'm wondering how much you have developed that vocabulary that you discovered in Hong Kong. You were saying that figure grounds don't work. It doesn't have any of the traditional spaces of, say, a gridiron city like New York. It had utopian components to it. I was wondering if in any way you became more systematic about trying to translate what you discovered in those drawings to I wouldn't say a methodology, but a different way of thinking about spaces, about cities, that you then would find place for, even in a very small practice.
It's a great comment and question, and maybe if Karolina were here, she would I can pin it on the missing partner, but she would be. The advantage of having two people is that it's, I think there's many advantages, but I think somehow it does maybe at times allow us to be more self-reflexive, but I'm not sure we are that self-reflexive. In all honesty, we haven't made a kind of monograph or a book of our practice yet, and when we give lectures, it's kind of the moment where we look back on everything retrospectively. Right, and I think it's, we have a very rigorous kind of system and method, I think, to how we work, but I'm not sure that it's, I think it's a lot of intuition too, and I think we're probably absorbing, the different projects kind of reappear in new forms, but probably in a very subconscious way. I mean, sometimes in a literal way, sometimes there's things superimposed from past projects into new projects. And we both worked at OMA for a long time, and that method we discarded a lot, actually, I think successfully, hopefully, but we certainly kept some things, and I think that part of what we kept is a kind of rigor related to kind of models and model making and recycling of things and superimposition of past projects, and so it may be happening through that. But even though there's two of us, I'm not sure how self-aware we are always of where the projects originate from and where they go, And it took us actually a long time to see that this house is kind of a staircase.
I guess I wonder if you see the potential in that book to be interpreted in that way, right? Apart from however you may subconsciously use it as an influence, does it have that potential to produce paradigms that could be useful?
I hope so. Yeah. I mean, because as architects and academics, I think we're always kind of looking for this continuity and asking these kind of questions. Whether the application of it. Yeah. I mean, I guess we'd be thrilled if it's kind of applied, and we've seen how it's like, I think, maybe applied in a very naive way. Like it's applied to kind of like, oh, we're gonna like design a kind of urban situation, and we're gonna include lots of multi-layered connections, and connectivity is not really the point, in a way. And so I think it's more interesting to actually make these kind of scalar jumps, and almost as you described it, like to kind of go to take one thing and that it kind of I always like to think of it as like a kind of process of like sublimation, which is like, there's phase changes from like solid to gas to liquid, but there's sublimation is like when one thing kind of skips phases, like liquid, it basically skips a phase transformation. I think because of all these scales, I think somehow that's happening, and sometimes we don't see it. Sometimes when like ice evaporates, you don't see it. And so I think that's like a little bit what's happening potentially in the work.
Thanks for the lecture. And you have to, like, the subtitle of this house has to be House Without Ground now. But I wanted to sort of draw out a little bit from your kind of last comment. I think it's really interesting how you work with typology in relationship to scale, or typology in relationship to territory. For instance, in the Xi'an project, the territorial condition is much more like the periphery of Texas, the peripheries of Houston cities, where it seems more like kind of a more rural landscape outside of a city. While with the narrow house, the periphery is actually paradoxically a series of very tiny, underutilized lots, right? And so they're both kind of peripheral conditions, but they have kind of radically different typological approaches, right? Where the Xi'an campus is much more sort of a systemic or kind of formal variation of the 5 square, while the narrow house is a much more kind of sectional approach, right? So they each have a different kind of typological approach. And I was wondering if you could maybe tease out a little bit more about your sort of the strategies or points of view or relationships between typology and territory, or more broadly typology and kind of scale, and how you kind of approach these sort of typology as more of a kind of a formal infrastructure versus typology as a kind of a very precise and kind of almost programmatic response to a site.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think we're definitely, typology is important for sure, and I think every project is, there's no real invention of typology. There's only kind of reinterpretation often. And the I should clarify that I think in the Xi'an project, I mentioned typology because it's almost kind of an outcome of the pattern of the. That I would say was like actually kind of a happy accident from what we were doing there. And in that project in Xi'an, and probably also in the Performa project, and maybe this is kind of an incorrect characterization, but I also kind of think of those, even though those are kind of fields, we're basically, our design strategy there is basically applying a kind of field. Or if we think of that also as maybe similar to the kind of the application of figure in other projects, like the kind of square or the circle, or the kind of, it's essentially a form that allows us to, that gives us a constraint to start working with. And so I think, I think also like, in a way, typology is also kind of a constraint, right? It's a set of, it's a kind of set of practices or kind of rules around a certain group of buildings, if you will, and there's degrees of manipulation that one can kind of perform within there. So I don't know if that answers that, but I think that's partially how we're thinking about it.
Mine is not a question. I was more I just wanted to congratulate you and your partner. Sorry she's not here with us tonight. I found this house fascinating, the way that you spoke about constraints and limitations, and the way you introduced us to the house by highlighting this narrowness. And then in the process of your intuition and your clear rationality and intelligence, you deliver a house that seems to be almost like an act by Houdini, the great magician that used to escape from the worst constraints imposed by his own sense of, let us say, pursuit of freedom and emancipation from even in water. And then here you found this extraordinary piece of land, and you discover this multiplicity of events that fascinate me, because suddenly this constraint has become an ultimate emancipation. I was fascinated by the way you photographed the house from above to make it look almost cavernous. And suddenly you photograph the house from the inside to make it look infinite. And even this little detail, as you enter the house, you open the gate and the house seems to levitate by addressing a small garden before you step into the living room. So the magic of architecture at that level of constraint is an ultimate performance act, no? And the fact that you found it through the limitations of that site it should give everyone optimism. And I just wanted to congratulate you for such a beautiful lesson about the power of constraints and their freedom. That's all.
Thank you.
Certainly one of your students has a question. This is your opportunity. Oh.
Oh, sure. So you started to answer my question a little bit already, but I was just curious about if the Platonic form as a sort of given.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Sure. I'm wondering if there's a comparison to be made between the Platonic form as a given and the sort of small and irregular lots that you're looking at in some of your later projects, looking back at some of the earlier ones with these squares and triangles and circles that you introduce in cases where maybe the building or at different scale the furniture or built-ins or furnishings don't really have to engage with the boundary that you're working within. Or if you're thinking about those in some sort of different way when you start to introduce these larger objects into your work.
So you're asking kind of about how the Platonic forms impact a project like this, which is very constrained, or
the opposite? If this is actually more similar in some way to when you introduce this Platonic form, because you're beginning with this, in this case, something that you're already going to be interacting with directly, the boundary of a very small site with a building that needs all of that space, with the master plan where you've talked about it in sort of a textural way with these large squares, or in maybe the multifamily housing where you've talked about it a little bit in a way of organizing space, but you've placed in these squares and triangles and circles, maybe to give yourself a constraint, as you've been talking about a little bit here, but I'm just wondering if you're thinking about them in that way as you do it.
Yes, I think so. I think in this case, the constraint is kind of given. In other cases where we don't have it, we impose it. And so, it gives us a set of, I'm not sure why we like to be so constrained, but I think it gives us a set of, it gives us a kind of problem, to work with. And it's, maybe it's also kind of a form of resistance around the kind of way we worked previously. Like at OMA, we just did I worked on projects in the Middle East for a number of years until the 2017 crash, and we did these kind of unconstrained projects, right? And we lost a lot of competitions there also, but it's another story. But, I think it's somehow, I think that, and we struggle with this kind of narrative about our own practice that we like to work with constraints, because then I think we get only clients with very small budgets or very difficult problems that we then in turn solve. But I think it's a kind of, it's somehow more generative for us. It's somehow more of an interesting territory to work. And so basically, yeah, they are two. It's either the constraints are given or that we impose constraints, I think, on ourselves.
The word constraint is maybe like, maybe too loaded in some way, because like, I don't know, it is generative, and as you're talking about it, like in this case you could call it a constraint, but in the case where you're imposing it as like a gestural square or something like that just like exists, that seems like a totally different thing, but this is really on that same, it's functioning in the same way. So I don't know, maybe it's a way to escape the terminology in some way, or that way of thinking about it.
Yeah, well, another way to kind of talk about it or to say things about it is somehow in the design process for this project, like because of the set of parameters around it, the solutions felt very kind of automatic somehow, and we got to kind of like I don't know if a sort of 0-degree architecture is the right word, but we did, there's like 60 elevation studies for this elevation, but it was obvious that there was only one way to approach the elevation in the end, even though we kind of looked at everything, and it was a matter of kind of an 11-inch kind of black band surrounding big pieces of glass, right? I mean, like, so, and I think and similarly, like in the kind of design of this project, because of those constraints or those parameters, the section, there were different sections, but it was clear, like a kind of the split level was the way to kind of produce openness without walls and stuff. So it was very kind of, the parameters led to a certain choices being obvious. And maybe if we have, too much freedom, it's harder for us to make those decisions. Also like a square is like is probably like the most difficult plan organization to resolve in many ways. Like if you really try to like work through housing or any other kind of program into a square, it's not easy. It seems like, and I think only architects probably know this, because it seems like generic or default, but it's actually not. It's never the default. It's never the easiest. So if you begin there, then there's you narrow the possible solutions. And I think and coming back to the kind of point about that being a kind of form of critique of where we worked, I think there was a iterative, like OMA works in a kind of iterative way, right? And when we started the office, okay, we're going to like make lots of options, we're going to iterate, we're going to do lots of things, and then we realized we don't have, because we pay interns and architects who work with us, we don't have unlimited labor to produce unlimited options. And actually, if you have unlimited options, like what's the value of this? So I think it's maybe kind of also the constraints are is kind of a check on a sort of iterative process, which is nonetheless important for us, but needs a kind of check.
Yeah, maybe less so a question, more of just kind of a thought. I mean, there's maybe a word in between the constraint and the things the figure does, and it's almost temperament. I mean, I look at the plumbing here. So OMA would have just run that pipe straight down, and then you would have had to just constantly move the pipe, and maybe you would have had an island. But then maybe seeing that pipe and not so much, and maybe even hearing it in the center of the room might have been the solution, almost laughing at the fact that the plumbing has to move straight through the living space. And Sanao in Gifu would have just probably moved it to the other window, or almost had it where there's no sense of like agonism in the space. The figure is not too big or not misplaced, because in Sanao it's almost like Gifu, like, oh, why wouldn't we put the sink separate from the bathroom overlooking the view, because isn't that the only way you could live? Almost like skipping the wryness of OMA. OMA would do it because it's funny. And because it's almost a kind of, not misanthropic, but almost sardonic way of living. Like, of course, we live where we and walk around our shit. And so somehow there's something in the temperament that's neither sana in a kind of effortless, well, of course. And it's not an OMA, well, of course you have to move around the poop, because why wouldn't you? And it's somehow there's a kind of, the figures are too big, but they're not clunky. And the plumbing is there, but it moves out of the way because it ought to. And I think there's something about that temperament that I think is quite incredible. It's not quite constraint, it's not quite agonism, and it's not quite sarcasm or irony, but it's an acknowledgement of the figure with this kind of temperament that I think is quite incredible. It's willing to put itself in trouble, but also willing to move out of its own way, like the Doors, and I think it's quite elegant in that sense.
Thank you.
I'm standing here trying to imagine all the different ways I could use only if in a sentence to wrap up. I'll spare you all the catalog of ideas I came up with, but just to say thank you.
Igor's probably disappointed. That I didn't explain
we
what
didn't
I was,
really learn the end. We didn't really learn the end at the end what only if is for. But we really appreciated having you tonight, and we certainly appreciate you working with our students and down here as part of the totalization group too. So thank you, Adam.
Thank you.